Chapter 1. Unveiling Desires. The evening breeze carried a hint of the approaching fall as Daniel Harper pulled into the driveway of his suburban home, a place filled with memories of laughter and whispered secrets. He had left work feeling optimistic, the dim glow of his dashboard illuminating a contented smile. Little did he know that the foundation of his world was about to shift dramatically. Inside, the kitchen was awash in the warm glow of under-cabinet lighting, casting long shadows across the granite countertops. Emily was there, standing by the window, a glass of white wine cradled in her hand, her posture relaxed, yet somehow charged with an unfamiliar tension. "Hey, Em," Dan greeted her, setting down his briefcase and loosening his tie with a practiced tug. "Smells amazing. What is for dinner?" Emily turned, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I thought we'd try that new Thai recipe you liked the look of last week. But first, we need to talk, Dan." Her tone was even, but the undercurrent of seriousness made him pause mid-step. He joined her at the counter, his expression turning cautious. "Sounds serious. What's on your mind?" Emily took a sip of her wine, her gaze drifting past Dan for a moment before locking back onto his. "I have been doing some thinking about us. About our marriage," she began, her voice steady but soft. "I love you, Dan. You know that, right?" Dan nodded, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Of course, Em. And I love you too. What is this about?" "It's just—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I feel like I am at a point in my life where I need something more, something different." "A different how?" Dan's voice was laced with a mix of bewilderment and concern. "I want to explore," Emily continued, her voice growing firmer. "I want to experience life from a new perspective. I've been thinking about us, about opening our relationship." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, settling into the corners of the room with an almost tangible weight. Dan felt his heart sink into his stomach, a mix of shock and disbelief coursing through him. "Open our relationship?" His voice cracked slightly. "Em, why? Isn't what we have enough?" Emily reached out, touching his arm gently. "It's not about our love lacking. I just crave. I crave experiences, adventures with others. It doesn't change how I feel about you." Dan pulled away slightly, struggling to process her words. "And what about me in all this? How am I supposed to just accept you being with someone else?" "I'm not asking for your permission, Dan," she said, a hint of steel entering her voice. "I'm telling you this because I respect you, because I believe we can be honest with each other." Dan shook his head, his previous calm demeanor giving way to frustration. "Honest? Honest would have been talking about this before you made up your mind, not presenting it as a done deal." Emily sighed, her expression softening. "I know this is hard. I don't expect you to understand right away. But I need this, Dan. I need to feel alive again, in ways that I can't just by being someone's wife." Dan stared at her, the woman he thought he knew so well suddenly a stranger in front of him. "And what am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice a mixture of anger and pain. "Just wait at home while you explore with others? What does that make me? You are my husband, the man I love and respect. This doesn't have to change us, not fundamentally," Emily replied, trying to bridge the gap between them with her words. But Dan could only hear the echo of his own heartbreak in the silence that followed. He turned away, the reality of the situation settling in like a cold shadow creeping through his veins. "Maybe I need some air," he murmured, heading towards the door, his mind racing with the implications of Emily's revelation. As the door shut behind him, the chasm between them grew wider, filled with unspoken fears and the stark reality of a future suddenly uncertain. Emily watched him go, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had irrevocably altered the course of their life together. But deep down, she believed it was the only way forward for both of them. Chapter 2. Echoes of Betrayal. The evening was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves under Dan's feet as he wandered through the neighborhood park. His mind raced, replaying Emily's words, each syllable echoing with a growing sense of betrayal. The gentle rustle of the autumn leaves seemed to mock his turmoil, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within him. After an hour of aimless wandering, Dan returned home, his resolve hardened. The house was quiet, the lights dimmed to the soft hues of nighttime. Emily was upstairs, probably expecting him to have cooled down. But the chill in his heart was not one of peace, it was the icy grip of a decision forming. He found her in their bedroom, sitting by the window, her silhouette outlined by the moonlight. She turned as he entered, a tentative smile playing on her lips, an olive branch perhaps. "Dan, I save it, Em." Dan cut her off, his voice low but firm. He couldn't bear the usual pleasantries, not tonight. "I've been really thinking about what you said, about us." Emily's face fell, the smile slipping away as she braced herself. And I don't know if I can be the open part of an open marriage," Dan said, his words deliberate, heavy with the weight of his heartache. "I need to understand, Em. Why now? After all these years, why do you need more than what we've built together?" Emily looked away, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. "I don't know if I can explain it in a way that'll make sense to you. I've felt constrained, like I'm losing parts of myself to the roles I play: wife, mother, career woman. I love you, Dan, more than I can say, but there's a part of me that's just suffocating." Dan felt a pang of sorrow at her words, the realization that her pain was as real as his, but the solution she proposed was unfathomable to him. "So your answer is to step out? To find yourself in the arms of others?" His voice was tinged with incredulity and pain. "It's not just about physical experiences," Emily explained, her voice a whisper. "It's about feeling alive, feeling valued for who I am, not just what I can provide. Am I not enough?" Dan's question was a whisper, vulnerable. "Have I not loved you enough to make you feel valued?" "You have, Dan. You always have. But this isn't about you not being enough. It's about me needing to be more," Emily replied, her eyes meeting his, pleading for understanding. Dan shook his head, frustration mingling with his sadness. "I need some time to think about all this," he said finally, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. "I understand," Emily said quietly, though her voice cracked with the strain of their imminent separation. Dan spent the night in the guest room, the space between them a gulf filled with unspoken words and stifled emotions. The next morning he called in sick at work, his mind too clouded with personal turmoil to focus on professional responsibilities. Sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched coffee, he dialed the number of his longtime friend, Mark Turner, seeking not just counsel but a vent for his pent-up emotions. "Mark, it's Dan. I need some advice." Mark's voice was steady, a calm in the storm. "What's going on, buddy?" Dan recounted the previous evening's conversation, each word heavy with betrayal and confusion. Mark listened silently, allowing Dan the space to express his pain without judgment. "Man, that is tough," Mark said when Dan had finished. "But maybe this is a chance for you to think about what you really want. Not just in reaction to Emily, but for yourself. What makes you happy, Dan?" The question lingered in the air, a challenge to Dan's current state of desolation. What did make him happy? Had he been so complacent in his roles as husband and father that he'd forgotten what it felt like to live for himself? "Thanks, Mark," Dan murmured, the gears in his mind slowly beginning to turn. "I think I've got a lot to figure out." As the day stretched on, Dan knew one thing for certain: the path ahead would be one of the hardest he'd ever walked. But perhaps, at its end, he might find a version of himself he'd lost along the way, or perhaps discover something entirely new. For now, though, the first steps would be the most painful. Chapter 3. Counsel and Consequences. The crisp morning air was unusually refreshing as Dan left the house, needing more than the walls of his home to contain his swirling thoughts. He decided on a visit to someone who could offer not just legal advice but personal insight, his sister Laura, who was a family law attorney. Laura's office was a blend of professional austerity and personal warmth, books lined neatly on shelves and family photos brightening the space. Dan was greeted with a concerned smile as he walked in. "Dan, what brings you here? Is everything okay?" Laura asked, her eyes searching his for signs of the distress that was evident in his voice over the phone. Sitting down across from her, Dan sighed, the weight of his marital woes briefly too heavy to bear. "It's Emily," he began, and the floodgates opened. He recounted the details of their conversation, Emily's desire for an open marriage, and his tumultuous feelings about the revelation. Laura listened, her expression a mixture of professional neutrality and sisterly concern. When Dan finished, she leaned forward, her hands folded on the desk. "Dan, I am so sorry you are going through this, but you need to think about what you want moving forward. This isn't just about how you respond to Emily's request, but what you genuinely want for your future." Dan nodded, the confusion slightly abating under her clear-eyed gaze. "I don't think I can be part of what she's suggesting, Laura. It goes against everything I feel about marriage, about us. That's valid, Dan. If your views on marriage don't align, and if compromise isn't possible without one of you being profoundly unhappy, then you might need to consider other options," Laura advised, her voice gentle yet firm. "Options like divorce?" Dan's voice was a whisper, the word foreign yet looming large. Laura didn't flinch at the word. "Yes, like divorce. It is a last resort, but it is there for situations where two people can find a way to make their marriage work under mutually agreeable terms. If that is the route you choose, I can help guide you through it, ensure you re-protected." Dan felt a mixture of relief and dread. "I need to think about it, Laura. It feels like giving up." "It is not giving up, Dan. It is about choosing a path that leads to happiness, even if it is not the path you envisioned," Laura reassured him. Leaving her office, Dan felt a small sense of clarity amidst the chaos. The next steps were still murky, but he knew he couldn't ignore his own needs and values, not even for Emily. The following days were a blur of introspection and long walks, during which Dan wrestled with his love for Emily and his inability to embrace her new vision for their life together. He realized that he had to make a decision, not just react to Emily's actions. One evening, he sat down with Emily in their living room, the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor, the remnants of their life together reflected in the half-light. "Emily, we need to talk about what this means for us," Dan started, his voice steadier than he felt. Emily nodded, her face composed yet expectant. "I have thought a lot about what you said, about what I want and need," Dan continued, each word measured and heavy with significance. "I can be part of an open marriage. It's not me. It is not what I signed up for when I married you." Emily's expression faltered, pain and understanding mingling in her eyes. "I was afraid you'd say that," she whispered. "I think it might be best if we consider separating, at least for a while," Dan said, the idea feeling both radical and the only viable path forward. Emily looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. "If that is what you need," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Dan felt his own eyes moisten, a mix of sorrow for what was lost and relief at the decision, however painful. "I think it is," he affirmed, his heart heavy with the weight of their shared past and divergent futures. As they sat together, the space between them filled with the echo of unspoken words and the grief of a closing chapter, Dan knew that the road ahead would be one of rebuilding and rediscovery for both of them. Chapter 4. Shadows and Showdowns. The air was thick with tension as Dan prepared for the inevitable confrontation. His mind replayed the countless scenarios, each ending in a whirlwind of accusations and heartbreak. He knew that tonight's discussion would set the course for their future separate, yet forever intertwined by the memories of what they once had. As Emily walked into the living room, Dan noted the resolve etched on her face, a stark contrast to the uncertainty that had characterized their recent interactions. She sat across from him, her posture rigid, signaling her readiness to defend her choices. "Dan, before we start, I want to say something," Emily began, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I know this hasn't been easy for you. It hasn't been easy for me either. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this to find a happiness that I feel we've both lost along the way." Dan nodded, his jaw set. "I understand that, Emily, but understanding doesn't mean agreeing. I've thought a lot about what happiness means to me, and it doesn't involve sharing my wife with others, no matter the reasons." Emily sighed, her eyes searching his. "I hoped you might see this as a way for us both to grow, not just apart, but into better versions of ourselves." "Growing apart doesn't necessarily mean growing," Dan countered, his voice rising slightly with passion. "For me, it feels more like breaking our vows, breaking what I thought was a lifelong partnership." The room grew silent, the space between them filled with the echo of his words. Emily looked away, her fingers twisting a strand of her hair, an old habit when she felt nervous. "Dan, I started seeing someone," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper as she braced for his reaction. The words struck Dan like a physical blow. Despite the discussions and the theoretical talk of open relationships, the reality of it sliced through him with a cruel sharpness. "Seeing someone?" Dan repeated, his tone hollow. "You mean to tell me that while we've been talking about hypotheticals, you've made it a reality? It wasn't planned, it just happened. He's understanding, and he knows about us. He knows that I'm not leaving you," Emily rushed to explain, her words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to soften the blow. "Doesn't that sound absurd to you? That you're not leaving me, yet you are with someone else?" Dan Seth's voice cracked with a mixture of anger and sorrow. He stood abruptly, pacing the room to manage his racing heart. "I need to be clear, Emily," Dan said, stopping to face her directly. "I can do this. I want to be the one waiting at home, wondering who you were with, what you were doing. I respect myself too much for that, and I respect what our marriage used to be." Emily's eyes filled with tears, a silent plea for understanding. "I didn't want it to come to this, Dan. I genuinely believed you might come to accept this new kind of relationship." "I can tee," Dan stated firmly, the finality in his voice more painful than he'd anticipated. "I think it is best if we start talking about separation formally. I'll contact Laura tomorrow and see what needs to be done." The word separation hung heavily in the air, a stark and irrevocable marker of the chasm that had grown between them. "Is there truly no way back from this?" Emily asked, her voice breaking as she confronted the looming end of their shared life. "Not for me," Dan replied, his own heart aching with the realization. "Not after this." As Emily nodded, accepting his decision with a resigned sadness, Dan felt the weight of their years together pressing down upon him. They had ventured too far into unknown territories, and now returning to the familiarity of their past was no longer an option. The night ended with a mutual understanding that their paths, once so intricately linked, were about to diverge. And as Dan left the room, the shadows of their parting seemed to stretch long into the night, a silent testament to the cost of seeking one's happiness at the expense of another's heart. Chapter 5, Paths, Diverge. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting lines of light and shadow across the living room where Dan sat, a cup of coffee untouched beside him. Today was the day he would meet with Laura to discuss the logistics of separation, a term that still seemed surreal to him. The air in the house felt different, heavy with unspoken regrets and the ghost of laughter that once filled the rooms. Dan drove to Laura's office, the roads familiar but his journey entirely new. The world around him moved on as usual, oblivious to the seismic shifts happening in his life. Laura greeted him with a somber smile, motioning him into her office. "I have prepared some initial paperwork," she said, her tone professional yet sympathetic. "We can go over everything and you can tell me how you'd like to proceed." As they discussed details, assets, living arrangements, the possibility of mediation, Dan felt a part of himself detach, observing the proceedings as if from a distance. It was the only way to get through it without letting the emotions overwhelm him. "Dan, have you thought about where you'll live?" Laura asked, breaking into his thoughts. "I think I'll look for a place close by. I don't want to move too far for Sophie and Ava's sake," Dan replied, the mention of his daughters tightening his chest. "That makes sense," Laura nodded. "We'll make sure that S factored into the arrangements. What about Emily? Has she mentioned how she wants to handle things?" Dan shook his head. "We haven't gotten into specifics. She's still coming to terms with everything, I think." Laura placed a hand over his. It's going to be tough, Dan, but you'll get through this. You're making decisions based on what's right for you, and that's important. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of legal terms and decisions that would shape his future. When he left, the documents under his arm felt heavier than mere paper. In the weeks that followed, Dan started to rebuild his life bit by bit. He rented a small apartment not too far from the family home, a place that was his and his alone. The walls were bare, the rooms echoing with the quietness of solitude. One evening, as he unpacked a box of books, Dan came across an old photo album. The images inside a younger Dan and Emily, smiling and carefree, were stark reminders of happier times. He allowed himself a moment of grief, a mourning for the past that could not be reclaimed. Gradually, Dan began to fill his days with new routines. He joined a local gym, took up jogging, and even signed up for a cooking class, something Emily had always managed at home. Each step was a small assertion of independence, a reclamation of the self he felt slipping away during the latter years of his marriage. Sophie and Ava visited him every weekend. They'd watch movies, play games, or simply talk about their lives. Dan cherished these moments, a balm to the ache of the divorce. His new apartment slowly warmed with laughter and stories, the building blocks of a new beginning. Meanwhile, Emily embarked on her own journey. She continued seeing the man she mentioned, but without the secrecy that once shrouded their relationship. In her own way, she too was navigating the complexities of her choices, learning about herself in the process. As summer gave way to fall, Dan found that the sharp edges of his pain had softened. The divorce proceedings continued, each legal formality a closure of what once was. He and Emily communicated when necessary, their exchanges polite but distant, a mutual understanding born of respect and irreconcilable differences. Looking out of his apartment window one quiet evening, Dan realized he was no longer just surviving, he was living. The path was not the one he had envisioned years ago, but it was his to walk, and he was determined to make the most of it, one step at a time. Chapter 6. Legal Tangles. The air in the attorney's office was stale, thick with the formality of legal proceedings and the unspoken emotions that clouded the room. Dan sat across from his attorney, Laura, in an environment far removed from the familial warmth of their sibling interactions. Today, it was all about the tangible threads that needed untangling: bank accounts, property, and most heartbreakingly, custody arrangements. Laura adjusted her glasses, her voice soft yet firm as she began the discussion. Dan, I've gone through the preliminary agreement draft Emily's attorney sent over. There are a few areas I think we should discuss more thoroughly, particularly regarding the custody and visitation rights for Sophie and Ava. Dan nodded, his features set in a grim line. I want to make sure that my time with the girls isn't just limited to every other weekend. I can just be a weekend dad. I understand, Laura replied, her pen poised over the document. I'll argue for shared custody that way. You can have more substantial and meaningful involvement in their lives. It is also important that we address holiday arrangements and special occasions. As they delved deeper into the conversation, Dan's mind occasionally wandered, not out of disinterest but due to the emotional weight each clause in the document held. It was a blueprint of a new life, dictated by legal terms rather than natural affections. Also, we need to talk about the house, Laura continued, shifting the papers in front of her. Emily wants to keep it since the girls are more settled there. Are you okay with that? It makes sense, Dan admitted, though the thought of giving up the family home tugged at his heartstrings. But I want to ensure the financial aspects are handled fairly. Maybe offset the value against other assets? That is a reasonable approach, Laura agreed, making notes. I'll draft a counterproposal based on this. The meeting continued with discussions on spousal support, retirement accounts, and other shared assets. Each decision felt like a small surrender, a step further away from a life once shared in harmony. Hours later, Dan left the office feeling drained. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched eerily across the parking lot. He sat in his car, taking a moment to breathe, to allow the reality to settle in. His life was splitting at the seams, being divided by the very laws meant to offer protection, and order. Over the next few weeks, negotiations continued. Emily and Dan met occasionally, always in the presence of their attorneys. These meetings were cordial but strained, with each polite exchange underscored by a current of shared pain and regret. During one such meeting, Emily looked more tired than usual, the strain of the divorce process etching lines of fatigue across her face. As their eyes met across the table, a silent acknowledgement passed between them, a mutual recognition of the sorrow that their journey had brought them. "Dan," Emily said softly after the attorneys had stepped aside to confer, "I never wanted it to end like this." Dan's throat tightened. "I know, Em. Neither did I. It's hard," she continued, her voice a whisper, "seeing everything we built being dissected like this." "It is," Dan agreed, his voice low. "But maybe it is necessary, for both of us to find some peace." They returned to silence, each lost in their thoughts until Laura called them back to the table. The discussion shifted to the final points of the divorce decree, a document that seemed so definitive, so final. As he signed the papers, Dan felt a sense of closure. It wasn't the victorious kind, but the somber acceptance of an ending that was essential for the beginnings they both sought, separate and distinct from the life they once dreamed of together. Driving home, Dan reflected on the day's events. The legal tangles were unraveling, but the emotional ones still knotted tightly within him. Yet, with each legal step completed, he felt a gradual unburdening, a slow but steady reclaiming of his future. In his new apartment, Dan looked around at the space he now called home. It was smaller, less filled with memories, but it was his, and in that realization lay a sliver of hope, a hint that eventually everything might just be okay. Chapter 7. Rising from Ashes. Months after the divorce was finalized, Dan found himself at a local coffee shop, his weekends now a blend of solitude and moments with his daughters. It was during these quiet mornings, sipping on his usual black coffee, that he often reflected on the changes in his life. The coffee shop, with its mellow music and the quiet chatter of other patrons, had become a place of solace, a space where he could think without the walls of his apartment closing in on him. On this particular Saturday, as Dan thumbed through a book he brought along, a friendly voice interrupted his thoughts. "Dan Harper, as I live and breathe. Is that you?" Looking up, Dan saw a familiar face from the past, Mike Johnson, an old college friend and former roommate. The surprise and genuine delight in Mike's expression were a balm to Dan's often weary spirits. "Mike, it's been too long," Dan greeted, standing to shake hands, the warmth in his friend's voice stirring a sense of nostalgia. "Too long indeed. What brings you here?" Mike asked, pulling up a chair. "Just grabbing some quiet time." "How about you?" Dan replied, easing back into his seat. "Same here, trying to escape the chaos at home for a bit." "You know how it is," Mike chuckled. Then his expression turned more thoughtful. "I heard about your divorce, Dan. I'm really sorry, man." Dan nodded, a small sigh escaping him. "Thanks, Mike. It's been tough, but I'm getting there. One day at a time, right?" "Absolutely," Mike agreed. "If there is anything I can do, or if you ever want to talk or hang out, just give me a shout. It is important to have friends around during times like these." Appreciating the offer, Dan smiled. "I might take you up on that." Their conversation shifted to lighter topics, old college memories, mutual friends, and life's unpredictable turns. By the time they parted ways, Dan felt a renewed sense of connection to the world around him, reminded that life still held moments of unexpected joy. Emboldened by the rekindled friendship, Dan began to reach out more, reconnecting with old friends and even making new ones. He started attending a local book club, where discussions about literature often turned into shared stories from life, allowing him to both listen and open up within a supportive community. Each step forward was a patch in the quilt of his new existence, colorful and varied. His relationships with his daughters, Sophie and Ava, also deepened, their weekends together filled with activities that brought them closer. They talked more openly than before, sharing their thoughts and feelings about everything from school to their hopes and dreams. Sophie, ever the perceptive one, once said during a particularly reflective conversation, Dad, I think this change, although hard, is good for you. You seem lighter, somehow. Dan chuckled, ruffling her hair. I think you're right, Soph. It's not been easy, but I do feel like I'm finding parts of myself I'd forgotten about. Meanwhile, Emily navigated her own path, her relationship with the man she'd mentioned becoming more significant. However, she maintained a respectful distance from Dan, ensuring that their interactions remained amicable for the sake of their daughters. One evening, as the autumn leaves began to turn, Dan stood on his balcony, looking out over the city that had been his home for so many years. The skyline was a silhouette against the orange-pink sky, a sight that always brought him a sense of peace. Reflecting on the past months, Dan realized how much he had grown. The pain of the divorce had not vanished, but it had transformed into something more manageable, a scar rather than an open wound. He had rediscovered his independence, his capacity for joy, and his strength in the face of adversity. Here's to new beginnings, he whispered to the fading light, a quiet affirmation of his journey through the shadows and into a new dawn. Chapter 8. Mirror of Memories. As autumn deepened into winter, Dan found himself walking through the park, the crisp air mingling with the scent of fallen leaves and earth wet from a recent rain. It was here, amid the quiet paths and bare trees, that he often came to reflect on the changes that the past year had brought into his life. Today, however, his walk was interrupted by an unexpected sight. Ahead on the path, wrapped in a heavy coat, her hair peeking from beneath a knit hat, was Emily. She hadn't noticed him yet, absorbed in her own thoughts. Dan hesitated. Part of him wanted to turn back, to avoid the confrontation of past with present, but a stronger urge propelled him forward. It was time, perhaps, for a conversation, not as husband and wife, not even as the estranged, but as two people who had shared a life and now walked different paths. Emily, he called out softly as he approached. She turned, surprise registering on her face before it settled into a cautious smile. Dan, she greeted, her voice neutral. It's good to see you. And you, Dan replied, stopping a few feet away. They stood awkwardly for a moment before he gestured to a nearby bench. Shall we sit? As they sat, a comfortable silence fell between them, each lost in their memories of the many times they'd walked this path together. How have you been, Emily? Dan finally asked, genuinely curious. I've been, adapting, Emily admitted, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, a familiar gesture that tugged at Dan's heart. Life is different, but there are good days. I understand that. Dan nodded. I've found some peace, too. It's strange how life takes us through such intense transformations. Emily looked at him, a trace of the old warmth in her eyes. I never wanted things to turn out the way they did, Dan. I hope you believe that. I do, Dan assured her, and I didn't either. But perhaps we needed to face those challenges to find out what we truly needed from life. Emily smiled, a hint of sadness in her smile. Do you ever regret it? The decision to end things? Not the decision itself, Dan reflected. But I regret the pain it caused, to both of us and to the girls. Yet I think we have managed to handle it as well as we could have hoped. You're a good father, Dan. And you were a good husband. I hope you know that. Thank you, Emily. That means a lot, Dan said, his voice thick with emotion. And you are a wonderful mother. The girls are lucky to have you. They sat in silence again, watching a couple of squirrels chase each other up a tree. The park around them was peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had once clouded their interactions. Life is an odd journey, isn't it? Emily mused aloud. Full of unexpected turns. It is, Dan agreed, his eyes on the path winding through the park. But I think it's those turns that teach us the most about ourselves. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Dan and Emily rose from the bench. There was a new understanding between them, a recognition of their shared past and separate futures. Take care, Emily, Dan said, offering her a gentle smile as they prepared to part ways. You too, Dan. Be happy, Emily replied, returning his smile with one of her own. They walked away in different directions, each carrying with them the bittersweet memories of what had been and the hopeful anticipation of what was yet to come. In the mirror of their shared history, both had glimpsed their true selves, and with this recognition, they stepped forward into the future, stronger and more certain of their paths. Epilogue. A New Day. A year had passed since Dan and Emily officially ended their marriage, and the seasons had cycled back to spring. The city was alive with blossoming trees and the vibrant colors of new growth, mirroring the new chapters unfolding in the lives of those who had once been a family. Dan stood on the balcony of his apartment, a cup of coffee in hand, watching the early morning joggers and the bustling street below. He had come a long way from the man who sat in the shadows of separation and divorce. His life now was different, fuller in some ways, quieter in others. He had found a balance, a new rhythm that brought him a peace he hadn't known he was missing. The book club he had joined became a cornerstone of his week, providing not just intellectual stimulation, but a sense of community. His circle of friends had expanded, and with it, his evenings were often filled with lively dinners, theater visits, and the occasional weekend hiking trip. His relationship with his daughters, Sophie and Ava, had blossomed beautifully. He was more than just a weekend father. He was a constant presence in their lives, attending school events, helping with homework, and sharing in their triumphs and challenges. The time they spent together was filled with laughter and love, each moment cherished deeply. Sophie had recently won a regional science fair, and Dan had been there, beaming with pride. Ava, with her sharp wit and boundless energy, had taken up soccer, and Dan never missed a game, cheering the loudest from the sidelines. Meanwhile, Emily had found her own path to happiness. Her relationship with the man she had met during her marriage had deepened, and they had recently moved in together. It was a decision she had come to, gradually, with thoughtful consideration, striving to maintain a balance that allowed her to be present for her daughters. One sunny Saturday, Dan and Emily met at the park for Sophie and Ava's joint birthday celebration. It was a casual affair, with family and a few close friends. As they set up picnic blankets and laid out a spread of food, the ease between Dan and Emily was evident. They had reached a place of mutual respect and understanding, co-parenting with a grace that came from recognizing each other as strengths. As the party unfolded, Dan watched Emily playing with the girls, her laughter genuine and free. He felt a surge of gratitude for the journey they had both undertaken, separate yet connected in the most vital ways. Later, as guests mingled and children played, Emily approached Dan, a soft smile on her lips. "You look good, Dan. Really good." "Thanks, Emily." "So do you," Dan replied, acknowledging her happiness with a nod. "It seems we've both found our way." "We have," Emily agreed, looking around at the joyous scene before them. "And I'm glad we could do this, celebrate together. It's important for Sophie and Ava." "It is," Dan affirmed. "They deserve the best of us, and I think we were managing that pretty well." As the party continued, Dan felt a profound sense of contentment. He had faced the unknown, navigated through pain, and emerged in a place where he could not only see but also appreciate the beauty of his life's new landscape. Looking out at the park, the laughter of his daughters echoing in the background, Dan knew that this was what happiness looked like. It wasn't tea without its scars, but it was real, and it was his. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the day, Dan felt ready for whatever new adventures lay ahead, confident in the knowledge that he had the resilience and the heart to face them.